Hey everybody, this is Cami Westall again with a review for Chapter 13. This is a pretty intense chapter, so I wanted to go over it with you in a little more detail since it will be on the final exam, which is May 2nd to 4th. Again, final exam will cover Chapters 13, 14, and 15, so I'm not making you do Chapter 16. But this chapter begins with a discussion on Christian humanism, or the Northern Renaissance humanism. Outside of Italy, as the Renaissance expanded, if you remember from chapter 12, as I'm sure that everybody does, there was all this discussion of humanism, and people were pretty obsessed with the ancient period of Athens and the rest of Greece and ancient Rome as well. And that's what the Renaissance was. It meant a rebirth of that period known as antiquity. So in the Northern Renaissance, they're reading all this old stuff, and they start to become interested in what people back in the ancient Roman time period were reading and doing, but they're a little more preoccupied with Christian documentation. And so the early Christians, what those people wrote about. So the Christian humanism takes a standpoint where people, instead of just trying to imitate what Greek philosophers talked about, they're trying to imitate or do what those early church fathers, the early leaders of the Christian church, tried to do. And one of the people who was influential in this Christian humanism was Erasmus. Erasmus used humor in a lot of his writings, but as it discusses on pages 418, 419 of your textbook, he really wanted people to be able to read the Bible themselves. Those are called vernacular translations, if it's in your own tongue. The Bible was only in Latin, and that meant common people like us wouldn't be able to read it. Only the church, the Catholic Church leaders, were allowed to interpret what the Bible said, and they would spew that back to common lay people like us. So Erasmus says, hey, people should practice that philosophy of Christ. The philosophy of Christ became a term associated with him in his writings, to do what Jesus did. But how do you know what Jesus was doing if you weren't able to read about it yourself? So he wanted a reform of the Catholic Church. He didn't want to leave the Catholic Church, but he wanted it to be reformed. He made fun, again, of a lot of problems within the church, a lot of the faults that were there, which there were a good number of them. And so he was very influential in leading to this break where we get the Protestant church. Another one of the Christian humanists was Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More had that famous book, Utopia, that was written. So again, utopia, we think of it as like a paradise, but it means, as it explains on page 420, it means nowhere. That's not a place that actually exists. And so you're trying to achieve this perfect world, and he has his ideas about what that should look like. But he again believes in this universal church, and that being very important to him. So it goes on some more about different approaches, people in the northern parts of Europe seeking to familiarize themselves with the early church, with the Bible. Mentions Thomas à Kempis, the author of The Imitation of Christ, on page 421. That is still one of the best all-time selling books. I think after the Bible, it may be the second or third most common Christian literature book that was sold. People learning to imitate, as in copy, what Jesus did. So all these reforms are starting to get underway a little bit, but it's going to be Martin Luther who will famously make that break with the Catholic Church. Luther, as it describes in your text, became a monk, studied at the University of Wittenberg, where he would go on faculty as a theology professor. And again, one of the strange things about this, to a lot of us, especially in the Bible Belt is you'd think, okay, if you became a monk, you'd probably know something about the Bible, but Martin Luther didn't because very few people had access to the Bible. The printing press was just gearing up. You were still only allowed to have that one Latin translation of the Bible. So Martin Luther, when he became a monk, which wasn't his intended route. He was supposed to study law initially, but once he became a monk, he had never read the New Testament. But if you're studying theology, and if you're going to teach theology, then that is a good indication that you'll become familiar with the Bible. And that made a big change for him. Luther was a guy who was never really happy. He was going above and beyond what he was supposed to do. He always felt that God was going to punish him and that he had never been forgiven fully from his sins or the ways that he had messed up. So he was always going really, really hard. And then when he started to read this New Testament, which was the part of the Bible written after the life of Jesus, then he started to be more at peace. And there was that idea then of justification by faith alone. It was only faith that Jesus Christ was the Son of God that would save him. And so he was good. And we probably never would have heard of Martin Luther if it wasn't for that indulgence thing. So this indulgence controversy that's mentioned on page 423 causes a big to-do because a guy named Johann Tetzel comes to Wittenberg and starts selling these indulgences. An indulgence was basically a piece of paper that you bought that would get you time out of purgatory. Purgatory was certain was sort of a an in-between limbo place, and so where your soul had to go to be purified. And Luther says, well, that's ridiculous. There's no way a piece of paper is going to get you out of that punishment. It's only faith in God. So Luther publishes his 95 Theses on October 31st of 1517. This is considered to be the start of the Reformation. A thesis, Thesis, like if you write a thesis paper or a thesis statement, that's one idea. Theses, those are plural. So the 95 Theses, they're 95 points that Luther goes and he posts on the doors of the church at Wittenberg. Church doors were kind of like community bulletin boards at this point. And these 95 Theses criticizing the Catholic Church and the indulgences and the popes, they are going to spread. The printing press helps with that tremendously because now people all across Germany can read about this. Luther has to be put basically on a trial at the Diet of Worms, where the Edict of Worms basically condemns him. And during that time, he's sort of put in captivity by his by a local prince who supported him named Frederick. But this his ideas spread, but the Catholic Church refuses to allow them, and so it leads to more wars in Germany, more arguments. Luther was appalled when he found out what was really happening, but that's where Protestant, the term Protestant, originated, because those Protestants were people who protested the way of the Catholic Church, and so a new Protestant church will form. So then it goes on about some of the politics at the time, the spread of the Reformation. Once Luther kind of made that initial break, other people said, oh, well, good, somebody else has done the hard work, so let me come along with my ideas. One of those was Ulrich Zwingli, a guy from Switzerland. Zwingli, like Luther, believed that it was only faith that saved you, but he did not believe in that transubstantiation, that big old word on page 427, where Catholics taught, and Luther as well, that when you take communion, or also known as the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist, one of the sacraments of the church, that it actually became the body and blood of Jesus. Zwingli says, I think it's more just symbolic. It stays as bread and wine. And so you can read that debate that's kind of funny on page 432. But it shows that there are a lot of other groups that are coming out now, people with varying ideas. They're all Protestants. They disagree with the Catholic Church, but there are varying groups of Protestants who emerge. Mention the crazy Anabaptists led by John of Leyden on page 435. And these were one of the groups that got really scary. John of Leyden thinking that a new Jerusalem would be formed in the city of Munster, Germany. And John of Leyden, he's executed, and his body is hung out along with a couple of his co-leaders in these cages to rot outside the church of Wittenberg. Of Munster. And if you go to Munster today, just to show the impact and all of the religious fervor that was there, those cages are still present. So the bodies were left to rot there on the church of John of Leyden and his co-leaders, and you still see those cages today. I think they've actually replaced the cages with new ones, but they remain there as a potent symbol of, hey, even if your beliefs are changing, you've got to maintain a level of sanity. You can't be threatening the public. And then we get into, it goes on about the Reformation in England a little bit, that will also create a new church. This map shows, in sort of the later 1500s, the religion, the pink being the Catholic faith that's prominent, the Lutheran faith spreading pretty quickly in the German area. But England's going to have this Anglican religion, or the Church of England. And that all starts thanks to Henry VIII. Henry VIII is King of England for a good chunk of time. He's mentioned on page 436. He is really a jock of a king. Very, very smart guy. Stuffed his socks or his tights there to make his calf muscles look more impressive. Always very proud of his beard. He would have ambassadors come back from other countries and ask if his beard was more impressive than the king of whatever other country. But Henry is a loyal Catholic. He even gets the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope when Luther starts his shenanigans. But Henry's got a problem. He wants a divorce from his wife, Catherine. He's not going to be able to get that divorce from the church at Rome. He wants to marry another lady named Anne Boleyn. But before he can marry Anne, because he thinks he can have a son with Anne, he's got to get rid of Catherine, who has only given him a daughter named Mary. Well, he can't get a divorce from Rome and the Pope, and so he breaks away. With that act of supremacy, he declares himself the supreme head of the Church of England. The Church of England is also called the Anglican Church. He basically creates a whole new church so he can get a divorce. So surely enough, he divorces Catherine quickly, he marries Anne Boleyn, out pops a baby, and it is a baby girl. He has another girl with Anne Boleyn. He then has her beheaded a couple of years later. So not a very happy end, even though he's changed the entire country from that. So Henry, he married 6 times. He finally had a son, a boy named Edward. And Edward became king for a little while, just a few years, 6 years after Henry died. But Edward was really a sickly kid. And so Edward died. And so that meant that Mary became the queen. Mary mentioned on page 438. This is the famous Bloody Mary, a game that scared me to death growing up as a kid, where you're supposed to turn around in circles in a dark closet or something like that. But Mary, her mom was Catherine of Aragon, a loyal Catholic. So Mary grew up Catholic. She changes the country back to being Catholic. She marries Philip II, the Catholic King of Spain, and she gets the title, perhaps a little unfairly, because there are many more kings and queens who will kill many more people. But Mary gets that title Bloody Mary for murdering the Protestants in England. So England has quite a time. Then mentions John Calvin, or Jean Calvin, as it would have been known in France, where he was originally from. The big word to associate with Calvin is predestination. Calvin believes God is so powerful and so strong that he has predestined everyone. It's not up to common people, but God has chosen who's going to be saved and who is going to be spending a lot of hot days in the realm of Hades. So Calvin, the predestined people are the elect, the ones God has chosen. The elect go live in Geneva, Switzerland, so he sets up an experimental town there in Geneva, Switzerland, where the elect can live. And goes on about some of the social consequences of the Reformation, which are important as well. The daily Bible reading, kind of this family unit that's there. And then how the Catholics respond. All these people are starting to leave the Catholic Church, so the Catholic has to reform its ways and make sure that they're a little bit cohesive. And one of the main leaders in that Catholic Reformation, also called the counter-reformation, is a guy named Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola founds a group called the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, who are still important today. They really are still around today. They really swore their loyalty to the Pope. They were the right-hand men of the Pope. Ignatius also wrote a famous book, The Spiritual Exercises, a training manual, as it says on 443, for spiritual development. So you read that book, it gave you very specific instructions for the Catholics on how to pray, what to do to strengthen Catholics to follow God. So the Jesuits started to carry the Catholic message to other parts of the world. They relied on education a lot. There are a lot of prominent Jesuit colleges, even in the United States. Georgetown, Xavier, Boston College, to name a few proud Jesuit schools. And another thing that the Catholics did, again, to make sure they were on the same page, was meet at the Council of Trent, on and off from 1545 to 1563. They didn't meet straight during that time. But some of the things that they came up with to put on paper and say, okay, this is what all Catholics believe, are listed there. They still said that only the Church could interpret what the Bible says, so common people weren't supposed to read it. They said that church tradition was just as important as the Bible. They still believed in transubstantiation, 7 sacraments. Luther taught there were 2 sacraments. And they even created an index of forbidden books. I don't think that's mentioned, but books that the Catholics weren't allowed to read, to ensure that all Catholics stayed on the same page. So then there's lots of political chaos, because some countries want to become Protestant. Some think it's only right to stay Catholic. You have people fleeing persecution, the Huguenots, many of whom came to Charleston, South Carolina, to escape persecution in France, the Protestants there. Horrible incident with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, where thousands of Protestants were slaughtered by Catherine de Medici and her son Charles there. So up to about 70,000 Protestants in France may have been slain. Strong kings like Philip are mentioned. Then it goes back to England a little bit on 454 and mentions the famous Queen Elizabeth, Elizabeth I, who rules for a very long time. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. She famously wore this really white makeup. She almost died from smallpox as a teenager, and that's one of the things that people did to cover up their smallpox scars. If they survived, it was to wear that white makeup, or to get the fake mole that moves around your head all the time in movies like Robin Hood Men in Tights or something. But Elizabeth, she isn't too religious herself. She has to deal with those Puritans it mentions. And she has to fight against Catholic Spain in the Spanish Armada of 1588, where Philip tried to invade England unsuccessfully. So the Spanish didn't make it to England. Elizabeth gave a very famous speech where she said that she might have the body of a small and feeble woman, but she had the heart and stomach of a king of England, rallied the people, and so England moves on with its under the title of the Church of England. So again, lots and lots and lots in that chapter. That was a very full, I think probably the fullest chapter in the book, but hopefully this gave you a little rundown of all that's going on.